All right, we're all set?
Yeah.
Okay, without further ado, thank you for being patient and kind of waiting for me. Hello, my name is Cortez Frazier Jr. I am a principal product manager at a startup called FOSSA. FOSSA, we do software composition analysis and SBOM management. And prior to kind of working at FOSSA, I worked for a company called Puppet, which you may or may have not had some experience with, kind of on the DevOps side, but then technically, I worked for VE Power. And that was really where I got like a lot of my experience on the cybersecurity side. I was a Senior Cybersecurity Architect for a team, honestly, G Power used to have headquarters out there like Marietta. I think they just kind of recently moved it. And so responsible for really about 1,800 developers, about 600 applications in my purview, only about 3 of us in the team. And so really trying to use a lot of automation to start to cover the manpower gap that we didn't have. So that's a bit about my background as far as, how I started learning about the cybersecurity space, particularly application security. And then of course I did that for a few years and then decided I wanted to kind of be a part of the solution, if you will, joining the commercial side and running into a lot of frustrations with SEA tool. So a lot to say. I will definitely be efficient. I know that obviously already very, very late. I want to make sure that I get you as much information. I do, well, I have like a dedicated Q&A section at the end. Please feel free to interrupt me at any time for anything that pops up. In particular, because it's going to be a lot of information. And so I'm happy to share, the slides afterwards, have more follow-up conversations one-on-one, if they're, that's beneficial to you. So what am I here to talk about? Okay. So we want to have a conversation around kind of 2 parts, if you will. So part 1 is how do we start to cut through the noise as it pertains to CVEs. One of the biggest problems, in my opinion, about the SEA space is that the vast majority of vulnerabilities are not exploitable in the context by which they're being used, and thus it just generates a ton of noise. And so between your static analysis tooling, then going to your SEA tooling, you then scan it again in a container, and if you import an SBOM right afterwards, you now have 4 to 5 different representations of the exact same vulnerabilities, often which are not executable. Sorry about that. And so that's going to be kind of part 1 of my conversation of what types of inputs do you want to think about when scaling an application security vulnerability remediation program to actually start to kind of cut that down and be able to prioritize in effective ways. I think 2 then is how we use some of these more modern tooling that's coming out, or modern frameworks is a better way to put that, in the form of software bill of materials and vulnerability exploitability exchange, so then actually communicate the exploitability statuses and the kind of life cycle of the remediated vulnerabilities. And that can be communicated internally to the stakeholders within your organization or externally to anyone consuming your particular software assets. And so maybe just like before I started kind of digging into things, just, show of hands, how many people have heard of some of these concepts like CVSS, like a severity extent? Okay, we're on board there. What about like EPSS? Vulnerability predicted. Okay, perfect. We got at least a few more, which is awesome. Have you heard of SBOM, software bill of materials? Okay, perfect. And then what about vulnerability exploitability exchange? Okay, cool. So kind of 50-50. No, this is good for me. It kind of helps me understand how much detail I should go in as I kind of walk through some of these slides. And so understanding CVE noise, that was kind of my primer. I already kind of gave you that opener. So I'm just kind of jump into some of these concepts. CVSS score. It sounds like almost everybody has a baseline there, which I'm really excited. Obviously, I'm going to go on chapter meeting there, so I'm not just going to touch on digging into that one. I feel like that was kind of where we all started in our vulnerability remediation journeys. So quickly run into that being an insufficient input to be able to kind of drive the type of change that we're looking for. I'm a huge fan of EPSS, the exploit prediction probability score. That we put this in there, or either way. The EPSS is really phenomenal. We work together with Jay Jacobs on the one of the co-creators for EPSS, and everyone's spent a lot of time on how you can use this to actually start to cut down some of that CVE noise. We also have the CISA KEVs. That's actually another one I didn't ask about. Is anybody familiar with the CISA KEV? Perfect. So the CISA KEV, known exploitable vulnerabilities, and they usually vulnerabilities that have had proof in the wild of threat actors actively implementing real-life POCs. And so you can think of the popular one, of course, Log4j, happened 3 Christmases ago, whole world freaked out, and that's how most of us got to a lot of these solutions today. Some other things, VEX data. So I'm actually going to really deep dive on VEX. I won't go too deep right now at this moment. This stands for Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. this on how you communicate your actual exploit status and not just the potential of an exploit, which I consider a general CVE to be. Reachability analysis, I want to spend some time on as well. This is actually then doing static analysis on your first-party code to be able to make assertions on if you're actually vulnerable in the context of how you're using these functions. Of course, there's a step further that I cannot get to, and I'll talk about that in a bit. The reachability has been a phenomenal input to start to cut down some of the CVE noise. And then business context, you'll hear me use this term asset decomposition a lot, which is trying to understand your individual assets attributes, right? And so is it externally facing? Does it have access to highly critical data? Does it have access to the crown jewel application or support some critical function? And then using that also as inputs. So let's look at a few. Let's look at a few more of these examples. Kind of like head on. So what does EPSS look like? At the end of the day, that's going to surface as a probability and a percentage. And so EPSS attempts to quantify the probability of a vulnerability actually being exploited in the wild, as compared to CVSS, which quantifies the possibility that vulnerability can be exploited. And so oftentimes you'll see people want to sort by EPSS score or filter based off of particular thresholds, which we'll talk to you about a little bit more here. Quick example of like a CSIC if you've never seen this, the known exploited vulnerabilities. This is oftentimes where most people will start, of where if there are any vulnerabilities we're detecting in their environments, that's on the CSIC list, go ahead and put those at the top of our remediation framework. So that way we can get rid of those, because that's more than likely what a lot of our business. Let's chat a little bit more about EPSS. And so these are all of the inputs that EPSS then aggregates and then puts through all kinds of fancy algorithms and OLM models to then be able to assert a probability score. The important thing to know about EPSS is it's changing. And so as more information is put out there in the wild, and that EPSS score can actually look at that, and thus the above or below sort of thresholds. And so when we think about EPSS, there's a couple of references that I want you to know about. First and foremost, what are my true negatives? That's my giant kind of gray circle here. And so these are vulnerabilities that are not exploitable that I also didn't spend any time working on, which is fantastic. There's then false positives within that, which are going to be ones that I spent time remediating or investigating, but ultimately were not exploitable, and thus have essentially wasted development resources on that. We then have true positives, which is our golden goose, that's what we're looking for, which are vulnerabilities that are actually exploitable, that we properly prioritize. Then of course the most dangerous are true negatives, which are vulnerabilities that are actually exploitable, that we did not prioritize. And so when you think about combining these four references, that will then turn into effort, efficiency, and coverage. And of course, effort being how much development resources they have spent going after particular vulnerabilities. We then have efficiency, meaning like of the vulnerabilities that I've covered and the effort that I've spent, how efficient was I going to do that? And then where this really plays out is anytime you're thinking about your own vulnerability remediation program, these could be your personal projects, this can be within your jobs or what have you. You have to figure out what threshold is most applicable for the assets that you're working about. And so to the far left, you can see that I can have a really low EPSS threshold, and that then is going to skyrocket my coverage, but I'm also wildly inefficient because I'm spending a ton of that in order to have that, right? And so if I think about, say, an application that is supporting my actual commercial products as compared to an internal development tool that is just helping a developer do status checks or something of that nature, I'm always going to have wildly different thresholds, so I want to apply there. And this to me is like the biggest mindset shift to start moving away from CVSS for vulnerability prioritization. And so maybe looking at some more tactical examples here. At the top far left, you'll see what most people do, which is they say like, hey, I just want to focus on critical vulnerabilities above CVSS score like 9.1 or something of that nature. You can see that while we have okay coverage rate, we're only about 33%, effort's pretty bad, and about 15%, not bad, but there's a 15% effort for that low coverage. That's your wild again. If you go ahead and bump that up to our EPSS threshold, the personal one that I recommend, is obviously going to be around that 2.2%, and that immediately bumps our coverage up to closer to about 90% for that exact same effort that we were doing with our CVSS kind of 9.1. And that difference, that delta between having a 33% coverage and a 90% coverage is huge to me. And it is why I think EPSS is a far better input to start thinking about vulnerability prioritization. All right, what else I got for you? Let's deep dive into reachability a little bit more, so I was going to kind of come back to that one. And so when we think about what reachability is doing, this is now taking static analysis components, right? So if you think about software composition analysis, traditionally, we're going to scan your manifest files or compiled jars or whatever build information you find to come up with a list of components. Based off that list of components, we'll start to stuff, right? That stuff could be vulnerabilities, it could be licensing information, it could be support status, right? A whole broad spectrum there. That was obviously very inefficient because just because you're using a vulnerable package doesn't mean that you're exploitable to that. And so this concept of reachability really became extremely popular. And I think a few different vendors, my company included, were trying to better confirm vulnerabilities. And so what we do, we just take static analysis on how you're actually using each one of those components. We then make a call graph for each one of those, and then we compare that to our own kind of knowledge base on known vulnerable components. So we go through every single CVE, we then go look and we say like, okay, for the particular CVE, where's the fix commit? On this fix commit, they got rid of this function, thus this is the vulnerable one, and then we can compare that from a database perspective. And so that now, quickly allows you to start to triage vulnerabilities because now you're no longer focused on just, does this package exist in my environment that's vulnerable, but now actually am I using this vulnerability, right? And so this is like a really tactical example here for this particular CVE. If you look down at the description, this is what I want you to pay attention to, it's basically just saying like, in this particular class here, this transaction manager lookup class, there's something vulnerable about it, which obviously isn't the most helpful. And so in all actuality, in order to be vulnerable for the CVE, you got to use this subtype validator function, and your transit dependencies might also be using that subtype validator function. And so that's the type of static analysis that we can do with reachability and find all that reachability. So, okay, that's on some reachability. Just some key takeaways on as we're thinking about these inputs before I start to get into the remediation lifecycle. But really trying to think about combining CVSS and EPSS together, to then start to use your thresholds for prioritization. Obviously prioritizing both vulnerabilities on the CISA levels, and then thinking about some of these more modern inputs, such as reachability analysis, is going to bring you a long way towards starting to expedite your actual remediation. And I'd say that that's the biggest thing without a doubt in 2024 for SEA tooling, that detection is easy, actually translating that to active remediation. So, all right, how am I doing on that one? Perfect, okay, we're doing good.
There's just one comment on here that the audio is fluctuating.
I see it.
Zoom people.
Is there a mic that I could maybe stand closer to, I wonder, or is it kind of?
I think it makes up the whole room because when we were talking earlier, they heard us.
Yeah, the whole room is mic'd, so.
Okay, so anywhere.
Might be turning, it's in, I don't know, but.
I will try to move around less and see if that maybe gives us some bandwidth. So that works for me.
Zoom people, let us know if it gets better. I'll let you know. Okay.
Perfect. Maybe I will take a second. So because I once again just threw a ton at you. Any immediate questions, and it's okay if not, but like do all these concepts make sense? Are we grokking or anything that you want to kind of deep dive into? Okay, that's okay. Perfect, that's good. That means I'm gonna keep throwing a ton more information back at you, which I'm excited about. Okay, so now that we have like an understanding of what inputs we want to think about for vulnerability decomposition, which is the term that you'll hear me use often. So we basically just went over vulnerability decomposition and asset decomposition. Now, how do we think about starting to remediate, to communicate the remediation and exploitability status for our different assets? So that's where software bill of materials came along to try to be the solution to communicate that. Sorry, so I was going to stop walking around, so I need to sit down. And so that is the solution to then communicate that, right? And so where software bill of materials really started to kind of come into play, I want to give you a little bit of a primer, deep diving more on what they are, where they came from. And so once again, fast forwarding back, SolarWinds basically was the catalyst for this, and they had a pretty massive breach in the software supply chain. A whole bunch of companies were affected. You can think of it as a much smaller version, I guess, than what CrowdStrike did. Slightly differently, because CrowdStrike was directly responsible unless some of the vulnerabilities on working things, but it was that level of impact where the entire nation had to take a pause. And I'll tell you what we were doing at GE, which was terrible. We were doing like regex queries in our GitHub environments, scraping through pom.xml files, trying to find like every location of Log4j and some of these other vulnerable packages, because we did not have the type of coverage. And so what is the answer to that? Allegedly, and again, I'll tell my opinions about this more, it's going to be these things called software bill of materials. And so you can think of this as, for lack of a better term, an ingredient list for your application that's going to enumerate all the packages that you have with the goal of someone else then being able to consume that. That someone else could be another part of your organization, say another department, and that could be a customer of yours, right? And so I am a medical device manufacturer, and hospitals are now saying that we want to know how vulnerable we are for these, EKG machines that you're tipping away. And so we will then go ahead and propose or give you the software bill of materials so that when the new vulnerabilities come out, you can then quickly be able to assess your risk. And so Executive Order 14028, I believe, kind of came out. And Biden administration is like, hey, everyone, if you're going to do business with the United States government, you have to start providing these software bills of material, and that kind of kicked off this catalyst. So that was about 2021 where that occurred. From there, just listing the components is not enough for problems that we've already kind of talked about earlier. So big problem one is if someone gives me a software bill of materials, they're going to import that into a tool like FOSSA or any of the other tools that exist out there, and then immediately going to start servicing a ton of vulnerabilities. And so if I am, FOSSA as a software consumer, my good friend Quincy here is consuming, our software programs, that even doesn't do any good because it does not have the context that we have to be able to say, actually, 90% of these vulnerabilities you don't need to worry about, Quincy, because we have inline mitigation because that particular problem is just like a test or compile dependency that's not really shit, and put that to. And so how do we start to communicate that context in a way that allows for software consumers to actually feel good about the software that they're using, but also software producers can feel good about putting SBOMs out there because they're not panic that people are going to really start to spend if their code is as far vulnerable than actually is. And so the answer to that, allegedly, is VEX, which is going to be the vulnerability exploitability framework. I use allegedly because I think the framework is fantastic. I think encouraging everyone to actually use it is much more difficult, which is limited on here today. I'm just trying to evangelize a little bit and start to keep thinking about how to be more transparent about software. And so I'm going to show some examples here today, but think about two parts to its communicating vulnerabilities. There's something called a VDR, a vulnerability disclosure report. And then that is purely enumerating CD information, what the severity is, how many particular packages are affected, what versions, that type of thing. And then there's the actual exploitability status, which is now that I've triaged this, I've gone through it. What is the test indicators that I've been applying for that? And so I'm looking at some of the VEX data fields. Let's just see the status, which is like, am I affected or not affected by this? And then a justification meaning, I'm not affected because inline mitigation needs this. You also need some form of unique identifier. You'll literally talk about two unique identifiers. One of them is significantly better than the other one, and then the other one is the opposite. But we have to talk about them. And so the first one is Perl, a package URL. We use that to uniquely associate an open source package or product, so we can surface vulnerability information. But then there's also something called CPE, which is Common Product or Platform Enumeration, which is created by Miner, actually, all these things that we do. Now that one is terrible. That's the one that is kind of helpful. It is terrible for a lot of reasons. And I'll kind of give a quick example later on. But just know that when you're looking, when you're looking to uniquely identify a package, you always want to try to find a Perl where possible, because the CPE is not going to be as valuable for your student. All right, so let's look at like kind of a tactical example. This is that VDR that I was talking about. This is an excerpt of the software bill of materials. This is specifically the vulnerabilities portion of this. You can see things like the affected assets, which is that package with all what stuff after it. And I actually do want you to zoom into that. Highlight a little bit. Zoom into this package piece here for this reference, because this reference here is what a package URL is. And so this will tell me that this package with crypto is version 1.10.2. It's on an Ubuntu environment, and that allows for me to then surface what vulnerabilities are for this specific ecosystem as compared to the Alpine Linux or Rocky Linux or Wolfie Linux for those particular. And then from the vulnerability disclosure report, you then have your actual VEX list. And so out of all of this information, the only piece that actually quantifies VEX is the analysis array. And so that analysis array is going to give me a status. Am I affected, not affected, under investigation, or fixed? And then if I'm not affected, I need to extend why. In this case, I'm saying that I have inline mitigation in place and I went to some additional information that you can go to then be able to understand that. And so this becomes incredibly powerful, right? If I am, a part of a 10-person development pod, right? It's a team, it's a team, and then we can all combine together into one application. How do I communicate to the rest of my members that the software that we're using from a downstream perspective is actually safe? That vulnerability exploitability information. Is how you go about doing that. In the same way the software consumers. So now that we have that kind of baseline, kind of one-on-one information, I'm gonna kind of deep dive and talk about a few tactics that you didn't want to think about. And it's 4 or 5 different steps. So vulnerability detection essentials. A lot of this is already gone over, which is great, so I'm not gonna go into too much, but just understand that at the end of the day, in order for you to search for vulnerabilities, you have to, one, have really good component analysis. So a lot of people do this manually today, where they're essentially using Excel sheets in order to do this, or they're, prepping comments and file what we were doing, which is terrible. I highly suggest at least using an open source tooling. There's a whole bunch of similar sticks out there in the world, or commercial tooling, like my company, FOSSA, so that way you can quickly understand the uniqueness of the packages that SBOM import is also something that's just become very popular. For example, I'm a hospital, I need to know what's going on with my particular hospital assets, and so I'll consume that SBOM, and then I'll be able to kind of assist you. Asset decomposition, we already talked about this a little bit, but what is the metadata on my asset that then makes me exploitable? And this is really important when you start to compare things like MP-based metrics. You may have an attack record report, but the particular asset is not externally accessible. So you can immediately ignore that vulnerability based off that. Another example is I may have a particular CVE that is exploited via an improper input validation, but this particular application doesn't take the user vulnerabilities. And so immediately, once you get that vulnerability, unless you're doing a SQL injection yourself, isn't valid. And then lastly, the vulnerability composition piece is all the information that we started with. What's the CVSS score? What's the EPSS? Is there reachability information for this? How much can I get about the CVE that will allow for me to make better decisions from an exploitability piece? This is always my side quest, but as I mentioned, of my 2 unique identifiers, pros are great. CP is bad. If you don't remember anything else from my talk, that's what I want you to take away. Because they are god awful. And this is the reason why, right? Which is for this particular, CPs are attempting to uniquely identify an asset. For this particular, Python Django package, they're all pointing to the exact same version, but some of them are, Django underscore foundation, Django hyphen foundation, right? Sometimes they, do DF as an abbreviation. And so if you then go do a vulnerability lookup and you're using the wrong version of the CVE, you will get 0 vulnerability results and falsely assume that you don't have any vulnerabilities, but purely because the naming convention that you're using does not match the one on the MD side. And so that'll be, I'll get off my more high horse after this one. But once again, CPs, got off, don't use them. Okay, cool. Now that we have an understanding of what our baseline is for kind of remediating vulnerabilities, how do we think about responding to new vulnerabilities? Because something that's critical on the application security side is regardless of what you do to your code base, new vulnerabilities are coming. Oftentimes, your legacy code bases are the ones that are more impacted because they're not using modern frameworks, unless they're not automatically updated. You may not have development resources dedicated to maintaining it. And so there can be a lot of challenges that being put out there. And so how do we think about responding to new vulnerabilities, right? At first, we have to alert, right? So going back to our component analysis or SBOM import or manual effort, whatever integration method that we're using that is actually taking an updated knowledge base on a daily basis and then doing a dip across all assets to see whether or not that. From there, you then start to triage, right? And so there's this concept, I won't spend a ton of time deep diving on it, but if you're ever thinking about how do I prioritize vulnerability, SSVC is very interesting. There's this stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization is essentially a decision tree that you can use to then decide for this particular vulnerability in combination with the asset decomposition information from earlier. Should I immediately remediate this or kind of put this in a backlog and figure that out over the course of the next few quarters, or next few years, or just nothing to worry about at all? And so after you successfully triage and of course you want to remediate, and come up with a remediation plan. So that's just fixing and updating the package that we're going to out. So I put in my mitigation around, particular input, so that way I can do input validation myself, even though the actual concept of this thing. When you think about remediation in particular, this concept of impact assessment is super important. And oftentimes you'll have a tooling, once again, whether that is commercial or kind of homegrown, that will say for this particular CD, in this case 2029.546, I can see that I'm using Jackson Data Line version 2.9.10.4, right? And so if I only want to solve my first level CD, I would jump to, and I apologize, I'm using 2.9.7, I would jump to 2.9.10.4. Right, but in doing so, I'm actually going to introduce new vulnerabilities, and I'm not actually going to resolve all the vulnerabilities that I've heard. And so this concept of impact assessment is really important, which is what vulnerabilities go away, but more importantly, is there a larger jump that I could make to actually put myself in a safe position. And so 2.12.71 is obviously where you want to go to, but you may be unwilling to be like a completely factor, because that is now ensuring being a minor and legal urban jump territory, we can do different. And so in this case, I would actually recommend going to 2.9.10.5, which then remediates all of these vulnerabilities that still patch up very best. In theory, if your developers using proper semantic versioning, will not require any refactor work, will also still have a great team. So big asterisk on that if they're properly following semantic so that's just one of the things that I want to kind of plant the seed on, which is if you're thinking about making these changes, think about vulnerability assessment holistically and not just on a per CD basis. You can see how we think about this kind of concept, which is going back to that. What is the vulnerabilities I need to fix now, my high priority ones, and what are vulnerabilities that I can deal with later? I just kind of bring this up, just kind of give you more tactical examples of how thinking about grouping and fix is very important. And then the one call out here for me is that oftentimes direct dependencies are the only ones that you can influence, but transitive dependencies is where most of your vulnerabilities will be. And so thinking about impact assessment from the lens of what direct dependency changes can I make to influence transitive dependencies is both critical, but also a wildly underserved market. Nobody does this well. And there's a lot of reasons why this is really, really difficult. I probably have to come back on another time and give you like a whole talk about dependency resolution and why it's extremely hard to know what transitive dependencies are being used in isolation of just a package. You have to take that entire dependency route from the build config of the entire application. So not just data services, but we'll say that's something under the help part. All right. So let's kind of talk about kind of VEX, right? So we've kind of talked about VEX, but how do I actually use this in the way that's effective for me throughout my remediation. And so going back to our statuses, I'm going to go through my triage page. I'm going to determine am I affected, am I not affected, and under investigation is going to be a vulnerability when I end up in that state, and then am I fixed? So I was once affected and I've done something about that, right? And so just really quick one there. From there, after you've now if I bring us all the way up to speed, right? So we've done our component analysis. We've now successfully triaged the vulnerabilities that we think are the most important based on the both asset and CVD positioning. We've now implemented some type of action that can be determining that there's no action needed to take place here. We're actually performing our remediation, and now finally we have to keep that to whoever else they take that. So that's the internal or external. That's where publishing statements kind of comes into place. This is a whole bunch of format that we know about do that in. Cyclone DX is a really popular one. It's called an SBOM format that supports the index. There's the CSAP and OpenDex and other frameworks as well. I'm happy to share this slide out to you so that way you can do some of this stuff later if you so desire. And then how do you think about policy? It's published daily in a sophisticated environment. How do that you dealing with as a successful commit that's been merged and kind of figure out so that we can all meet this, shift left desire that all that element was. So ultimately, VEX, how often we're going to do it per build, and then we want to do this in a structured format so that we can consume that and then automate that process from this. Another big consideration when kind of publishing both SBOMs or VEX statements in general is that you have asset information that's static versus asset information that's dynamic. And so that static information, right? The name of a component, the version of that component, the license information associated with that's not going to change over time. That dynamic information, such as vulnerabilities being introduced or support status, 100% are going to change. So oftentimes you want to decouple the static information, that's on itself, from the dynamic information and publish those. Last piece here, we're getting close to the finish line of my talk. At the end of the day, we've really kind of hammered through how you would go about communicating VEX from a software producer's perspective. But if you're using a software in your organization, I highly encourage you to think about actually consuming SBOMs from your software vendors and then being able to run a similar program. You cannot influence dependency upgrades, obviously, but you can harass them or make their next renewal really, really difficult because they're not really keeping you secure on violating their vulnerabilities. And so you can just see this kind of instant example of how I would consume a piece of software. I would use the VEX information to decide, hey, for this particular CVE, are they exploitable based off of their determination, not my determination? And then from there, I can make some risk-based decisions on if I want to isolate this asset, if I want to, just let it be and accept that risk, or whatever it's in that way. So, in summary, just a few kind of recommendations and key takeaways. EPSS threshold is extremely powerful, right? So EPSS and CVSS are like the two things that I for sure want to take away from the talk today. VEX statuses are definitely king, whether you're exploiting or whether you're communicating that internally, which oftentimes we have these massive organizations, some of our companies that have 500 different departments. The left hand's not talking to the right hand, so having a central repository, and then you look at all this package of vulnerability uses. That's where you will really want to leverage VEX statuses. But then, of course, if we have car manufacturers of the world, right, your GMs, your Fords, who are then consuming 100 different software products that then go into your effort, right? So how do they make sure that you're not vulnerable enough to think it's something that happens out later, and they're going to consume it from analyst SBOMs from their certified application. Making sure you diff between that static and dynamic information and publishing. I think it's going to be very important. And at the end of the day, your VEX program is only as powerful as your inputs. And so if you don't have proper unique identifiers like a Perl, then the outputs are going to be really different. So with that, I appreciate everyone's kind of time, energy, and attention. Once again, I'm happy to share slides with you if you want to have like some more deeper dive conversations on how to start a vulnerability management program, or want to pontificate on how SBOMs are shit and maybe they should just be given up on. I'm here for any spectrum of where you'd like to be in that conversation. But I appreciate your time, and once again, happy to answer any questions if there are any. If not, I just want to mingle and get them up people.
I have a question. So let's say you are working for a big company,
Yep.
and they're using the temporal rating, CVSS 3, right? How do you go from that?
Mhm.
You've got over 100,000 assets, you got, left is the top of the right, everything that how would you go from that rating over to like a VEX?
Mhm.
Like, how would, first of all, does every vulnerability have a VEX? So I haven't really heard about the VEX, so.
Yeah, these are all really, really good questions, but I'll try to address it in a few different pieces, and then we can deep dive more, right? And so part one for me is how I take kind of like a legacy model that I'm drowning in CVEs on and start to migrate that to a more dynamic.
Yeah, exactly.
Software. And so step one is coverage, right? Which is oftentimes where a lot of people are failing, because you have to have at least some centralized repository for this information, right? And so have complete coverage across all of the assets, at least the ones that are most important to you. And so that's step number one. Step number two then is, how do you, going back to those like EPSS thresholds, you really have to hammer on the thresholds because you're not going to have the development capacity to get to every vulnerability. And in order to do a VEX, you actually have to investigate that individual vulnerability, which should take upwards of 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the complexity of the CVE. And so what I would do is come up with a really, really broad EPSS threshold. And so maybe try to bump it down to like the 3% range. So that way you're not missing any like truly exploitable vulnerabilities, but at the same time, you're moving full-time out. I would assume about 70 to 80%. So now that you're down to this 30%, that's where you then have to kick off some type of process. And so whether that's looking at Jira tickets, GitHub issues, right? That's the work, for lack of a better term, of where each vulnerability that's within that threshold is then analyzed. And the development teams responsible for that application are going to be the only one who can actually answer that question for you on if it's good. And so that's how it started. And yeah, that's pretty something I do that way.
Wondering, is VEX really only for stuff you build yourself, with dependencies, or can I take like the red method recorded, but maybe we would use those to that kind of commodity back for, or is it really with technology?
No, I think we use it for both, right? Which is like, it kind of depends on, what side of the software lifecycle, right? And so if I'm, say, taking, I'll go back to my Ford example, right? So I'm an F-150 and I'm like, hey, I gotta install this infotainment system. Then I actually have no insight into the development of that infotainment system, but I'm ultimately still responsible for security of this asset. So in that case, I would actually need the infotainment system developers to communicate that to me. So that way I can then make determinations on if this is safe to share. Right, and then I think obviously on the opposite spectrum for both of the development yourself, then you're the one responsible for creating it. So it's this two-way street, and that's admittedly where the big problem is with the industry right now, is chicken for the egg scenario, because nobody wants to start, right? And so you have like some early institutions, you'll see like Red Hat, VMware, Splunk, some of these like really modern tech companies that are very comfortable just kind of putting their SBOMs and VEX statements out in the world for anyone who's using it. Much more difficult to convince like a GE or Ford or some of these more like older technology companies. Or, I would say widely afraid someone is then going to reverse engineer their products based off an SBOM. And then I'm going to change it now, but I do want to note, like, that is, in my opinion, a wild assessment, right? We think that somebody can take just a component name and version of the CVE and then, do some exploitability information based off of that is more of a test of the redundant controls that you have in place that are going to be out. So don't let anyone try to scare you off by publishing an SBOM. You're somehow going to put your company at more risk of that. I think that's incredible for us. But then I answered your original question around like, how do you start to kind of make that? It's a lot of political cultural shift stuff that's going to be the hardest. And so I think the key, in my opinion, is setting that really wide EPSS threshold. So that way you're not overburdening your development team and being able to just kind of focus on sub-records.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Outside of that, any other questions? Please, you got my friend.
I'm sure if I'm about to get ahead of myself, but are there like frameworks and speaks to the maturity of?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So they do have some frameworks. There's one called OpenSSF, open source scorecard. I cannot remember what the acronym actually stands for off the top of my head, but you can definitely Google it. And that, while it doesn't assess your maturity for VEX specifically, what it does assess is your maturity from an application end, right? And so do you have static analysis tooling? Do you have SEA tooling? And a component of that is, are you communicating vulnerability information in the form of VEX? And are you publishing SBOMs? So you'll essentially get a higher score if you're doing all these things, you can maintain your components, you're using widely outdated stuff. You have a lower score if you're not participating that way. So that's probably the best way externally to try to analyze that. I think internally, right, if you're looking at your own organizations and you want to assess them, I think there's some really clear areas. Is one, are you publishing SBOMs in the first place? If you really consider. Two, are your VEX statements all just under investigation, or are you actually communicating not affected participants? You'll see a lot of companies that are going for like a cop-out approach and say, well, we'll just say everything's under investigation, but then you can't dismiss one way or another. And so I would specifically be looking for affected versus not affected. I struggle because there's a lot of, obviously a commercial software product, I want to help my customers to the best of my ability. Oftentimes some people are very transparent and looking to hide risk, right? They're saying, hey, we will communicate it's not affected, but we will not actively communicate it's affected. You have to find out about your own. I think that's a bit of an ethical compromise on my point, but those are the type of things that I'm assessing.
What's that?
OpenSSF, yeah, OpenSSF.
There's a lot of CVE. We all covered with the or just.
To my knowledge, all CVE should have a EPSS score associated with it. Now, how accurate that EPSS score is the hard part, right? So the model basically, to my understanding, runs like every day. It's like recalculated based on some massive AWS or Azure, cloud services that they have kind of going on. And so every time MVD is updated, they'll then do an assertion on that. But because that EPSS score is living, they may not have exploitability information on that CVSS for the first help. There may not be very much chatter about that, right? There may not be anything on Hacker News. So then as that chatter starts to pick up, as those exploits appear, then they'll list that EPSS. And that's just a note for giving you this opportunity. That is the reason why CVEs are terrible, because they only are created when a vulnerability exists on a patent. But the package exists long before new vulnerabilities were created, and that's how you use it for that. That's a great question. Yeah, for my friend.
I just want to recap all the things that you could put in an SBOM if you're getting out of consumers. Cover a lot of different patterns. So
Absolutely.
SBOMs are not just all the components of the piece of software. You could also have a VDR in there.
Yep.
You could have VEX in there.
Yep.
And you could have a Perl in there as well.
100%.
If you put all that together, that makes super.
I would consider that the bare minimum of like what would then give me like a high quality picture on any software that I'm using. So I think you're 100% spot on. You have the SBOM itself, which, you know, that has wild and varying degrees of how much information you need, right? Maybe you care about license information. My company actually started originally as a license compliance company. And so doing things like, oh, I don't want to have LGPL on my code base because then I'm going to have to open source my entire code base for a commercial product. It's terrifying. Right?
Not AGPL.
AGPL, thank you, right, LGPL, it depends on if the product's distributed or distributed versus not. But yes, 100% HPL, and so, you know, that's a big concern, so you may decide whether you want to include also copyright information in your experience. But for a vulnerability management program, you need the Perl, the unique identifier, that VDR, the vulnerability disclosure report, and then the VEX. And with those three pieces, you can do just anything. I'm really excited. Those are all really, really good questions. Normally I bore people to sleep because it's too much information. So I'm happy that we're here to participate. So. Cool. Well, with that, I know we got a hard stop in a little bit. I'll still be kind of hanging out if anybody else wants to have any more conversations, but I'm really appreciative of this opportunity.
How will you share the slides?
I can email that this way, and then I think you can share it out to the greater audience if that works.
And usually the recording on Zoom is sent to me by the time I get home, and I upload it tonight and tomorrow morning, and you can go to YouTube, Go Wasp Atlanta. And we're all there. We had also a talk a few months ago about SBOMs with seven and
Yep.
Cyclone, right?
Yes.
Cyclone DX. So that's like further into the rabbit hole if you guys want to refer back to that talk.
Absolutely.
But,
Yeah. Singer's an awesome company, and Cyclone DX is a fantastic standard. Steve Springett, I think, was the co-creator of the most some work with them.
Yeah, this is really informative. So, thank you.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for your time, everyone. And yeah, I'll share this out as soon as I get an opportunity.
Thank you.